They left a yellow slip on my front door, and I thought it was a joke at first. 3 little lines about community safety and temporary custody that didn't belong to anyone sensible, then the kind of bureaucratic handwriting that pretends it's law. By the time I read it all the way through, my hands were shaking and the house felt too quiet, like someone had paused the world while I blinked. My name is Eli Parker, and for 20 years I wore a badge on my chest that said, "Judge not the kind that grandstands, the kind that sits behind a bench and watches people try to break each other." I believed in law the way most folks believe in gravity. Turns out, gravity doesn't help when your own neighbors decide they've been deputized by a piece of paper. That morning started ordinary. Cereal box, the kids arguing over the last blueberry muffin, my wife waving me off at the door like she does when I bring too many files home. Small domestic things that make you human. Ben was 13 and stubborn. Sophie was 8 and convinced she could train a cat. I kissed her head, told them to lock the door, and drove off thinking about a docket. I wasn't thinking about HOA letters or community guardianship clauses, because in the county records our street sits in a patch where the HOA technically has no jurisdiction. That was the whole point of the property line dispute we'd settled 3 years back. I thought that settled things. I thought, naively, that a judge's home was safe from small tyrannies. When I came back 2 hours later, the house was empty. Backpack still by the door. The coffee cup on the counter. The television blinking to a paused show. And on the door, the yellow slip, this time thicker, taped, official looking with a note. Children placed under temporary community care pending review. I called my wife's number until voicemail swallowed my patience. I called 911. The operator was calm, professional, and then very human when she told me the report they'd received named my address and the HOA as the custodian. I laughed at first because what else do you do when nonsense arrives dressed like law? Then the laughing broke into something less tidy. The first person I saw from the HOA was Marla Haskins, the woman everyone in our development politely called involved. She arrived in a beige blazer like someone who always had to look smaller than her ambitions, accompanied by 2 men who could have been security guards or the wrong kind of contractors. Her smile was the practiced kind that thinks of consequences as art supplies. When I stepped onto my porch, she said, "Eli, we're looking out for the kids' safety." Her voice was syrup pretending to be steel. I told her she had no authority to remove my children from their home. She cocked her head, like I'd offered an interesting thought experiment. "We have a clause," she said, as if clauses were shrouds. "Community welfare supersedes parental neglect in emergencies." "There is no emergency," I said. You can't take children." My voice stayed steady, more out of habit than control. Marla smiled, as if shifting power into place were a party trick. One of her men cleared his throat and said, "We followed procedure." That line, "we followed procedure," is how ordinary people are made to feel small. I saw officers glance at one another, unsure, because police like clarity, and this was administrative fog made flesh. The raid wasn't cinematic the way movies make it. There were no sirens blaring, no dramatic kicking down of doors. It was quieter, bureaucratic, and brutal. A van with the HOA crest, a gaggle of paperwork that smelled like confidence, a clipboard, signatures that were photocopies of conviction. When they told me where the children had been taken, a community training center turned interim care facility, something cold slid under my ribs. I drove like an animal that had learned how to read names on maps. I remember hillside trees running past the windshield and the way my hands felt too big on the wheel. I still remember the first sight of Sophie. She was sitting on a small plastic chair, knees up to her chest, clutching a stuffed rabbit with one ear flopped over. Ben stood with his arms crossed, jaw tight, trying to hold himself like a man because at 13 boys think holding still is how they prove courage. Seeing them, their legal paper between them and me, badges of homeowner association membership more potent than blood, it chipped something in me I didn't know could break. I walked in and I didn't ask for permission. I told the woman behind the table that those were my children. She looked at my face and then at a folder and made a calculation I didn't like. Marla was there, leaning against a pillar, and when she saw me approach her, she tilted her chin like a person who knows how to tie knots with other people's misfortunes. "Mr. Parker," she said, using my full name like a ledger entry. "This is a protective action." I said, "You call this protective? You write a line and take kids." She sighed like a librarian forced to explain a story to a child. Preferences of the community matter, she said, and the words felt like salt. There's a scene I carry now not just in my head, but like a movie clip stitched into memory where Ben finally speaks, and his voice was small and fierce. You're not family, he said to Marla. You don't get to decide. Marla's face softened for a moment, then hardened into the civic armor she'd been hired to wear. We're protecting what's best for the greater good, she said, as if that phrase could fill all the empty places she left in people's lives. After that day, things accelerated the way bad ideas metastasize. My friend and legal partner, Rico Alvarez, started combing through records like a man reading a novel for inconsistencies. We found shell fines, late fee scams, a ledger of community fees that funneled into accounts with names that meant nothing except they did mean something when you follow the money. Not every stranger with a clipboard is corrupt. Not every neighbor who raises a hand is a villain. But power, when it tastes like profit and respect, learns how to justify itself. We subpoenaed records, we pulled bank statements, and we found a pattern. The HOA hadn't just overreached, it had weaponized petty authority into a machine. People like to think a courtroom will fix everything. Evidence is neat and sentences are measurable, but real life rarely follows legal neatness. We staged a takedown that was as careful as it was inevitable. Warrants based on fraud, conspiracy to deprive civil rights, unlawful detainment. When officers knocked on the clubhouse door, Marla's smile finally cracked. She tried to call it a misunderstanding, then a community necessity, then a misapplied statute. The men who signed off on detentions tried to shrink behind procedural language. I watched crusted rationales peel away like paint. The things they thought would protect them, paperwork, precedents, small-town approval, began to look flimsy against subpoenas and bank audits. The courtroom was the last scene, and it needed no music because the truth carries its own weight if you let it. Ben sat at my side, taller now in a way not just measured by inches, but by something steadier. Sophie doodled on a legal pad, making heads with big smiles, because children still draw happiness the same way they still fall asleep when rocked. Marla sat in the defendant's chair and, for the first time, seemed uncertain of the script. When the prosecutor spoke, it wasn't just about fines and ledgers. It was about trust betrayed and lines crossed. We didn't need theatrics to make the point. The documents did their work. In the end, justice is messy and not always immediate. There were settlements and sentences, restitution that would not repair every wound, apologies that sounded like contracts. The community itself had to reckon. Neighbors who'd looked away had to look closer. Friends who'd been seduced by constraints had to find their courage again. The HOA board dissolved. Some of the men who'd signed the papers resigned, quietly, like men removing masks that had become too heavy. But this isn't a tidy victory speech. I still look at my kids and feel the same edge of vigilance I felt the day the yellow slip appeared. I still watch neighborhood meetings with an eye for the small power plays, the cliques that dress themselves as committees. Power doesn't go away because someone's been indicted. It learns. It hides behind bylaws and better branding. The lesson I learned, the thing that sits with me on quiet mornings, is this. Complacency is permission. When a community hands over decision-making to the loudest or the most polished, the rest of us become collateral. We changed addresses in the county registry. We tightened language in deeds. We taught the kids what rights actually feel like. That's practical work, but the deeper work was about how to live with one another without turning neighbors into authorities. There's a balance between community care and community control, and it's a fragile thing. When we trade skepticism for convenience, we hand over pieces of our lives that are hard to get back. So I'm telling you this not because I want sympathy. I'm a judge, and I was lucky enough to have resources and knowledge, but because this could happen to anyone. It can arrive in a yellow slip, a smiling woman with civic ambitions, or a clerk who thinks rules are more important than people. Watch the paperwork, sure, but watch the people behind it more. If your neighbor wants to solve problems with secrecy and signatures, ask why. If you see a rule that benefits a few at the expense of many, question it. Community is not an abstract good. It's made up of the small, stubborn acts of people choosing to be honest. If this story stirs something in you, if you've seen a similar small tyranny in your own town, I want to hear it. Tell me what you think is right and what's wrong, who should be trusted, who shouldn't, and where you draw the line between looking out for your neighbor and policing them. Drop a comment, share this with someone who needs to listen. And if you've got a community story good or bad, I'll read it. Because the only thing worse than one HOA running roughshod over a family is a whole county shrugging and saying, well, it must be legal. What matters is not who wins a paper fight, but how we teach the next generation to hold power accountable.